Yo, everybody. Welcome to Off Panel, a weekly interview podcast about all things comics, brought to you by Sketch.com. I'm your host, David Harper, and this week's guest is the cartoonist behind the graphic novel The Chancellor and the Citadel, as well as the artist of the upcoming graphic novel, Who Was the Girl Warrior of France, Joan of Arc. It's Maria Frantz. Thanks for coming on, Maria.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So we're going to talk about your work here on the podcast, but as I often do with first-time guests, I want to start at the beginning, which is extra important for you because this is a first for me. I think you're the first person I've ever had on the podcast that's actually a creator that was born in my home state of Alaska.
Yes.
You were born and raised in Fairbanks, right?
Yes. All of my entire childhood spent in the same spot, same city, same house. That's where it all happened.
Yeah. Well, so I live in Anchorage, which is, for listeners, about a 6-hour drive from there south, which might not sound like much, but they're much different places. I think it's funny. It's like, I think a lot of times when people visualize Fairbanks, they visualize that like the people in bikinis and swimsuits and stuff standing outside the UAF, University of Alaska Fairbanks temperature gauge, where it says like -40. It gets extremely cold in Fairbanks, also extremely hot because it's a very interesting place. But what was it like growing up in Fairbanks? Even for somebody from Anchorage, it's a much different place. Yeah,
totally. I feel like only now I can look back on it with context, because when you are the same place for 18 years of your life, it just sort of, you're like, oh, this is what it's like growing up,
Mm-hmm.
But looking back, it was pretty isolating in a way that was good, and also in a way that I sort of sought to change later in life. Like, it's basically like there's, this of course, but it's like Fairbanks, and then like around it is just 200 square miles of just like trees all the way around it. There's no like, we did the Fairbanks to Anchorage road trip quite a few times in my childhood, because that was like the only town you could really visit that had like, stores and whatnot. I think it was good for me because I think there's not a lot of social pressure to like dress a certain way, or everyone's just kind of like doing their own thing in Fairbanks. At least that's what it felt like with the communities that I was a part of. And I think everybody's community oriented in a way that I haven't found in a lot of other places. I don't know. It was a friendly place to grow up, and I think it had a sort of a lasting impact on my art too, just in terms of like nature and like, I don't know, being so close to places that people would usually have to travel to go visit too.
Yeah,
I think it's something I didn't really appreciate until later in life too. It's like people like spend like years like dreaming of like, traveling to Alaska and seeing the sights. I just got to live in it. For me, it was just normal. And I think I've sort of had a fascination with nature and sort of like the natural worlds in a way that I probably wouldn't if I hadn't grown up there.
I think that's one of the funny things about being in Alaska is, I had these friends that were teaching at a German immersion school here in Anchorage that's called Rilke-Schule, and they had never been to Alaska. They'd never been to anywhere like Alaska. And they come there and they're just like, oh my God, do you want to go dog sledding? Do you want to go this? Do you want to go that? And I was like, what? Okay, I guess. And then I go do all these things. And I was like, I realized that I had never done any of these things in my entire life. And it was interesting because, like in Anchorage, on one side, we have like in a massive body of water. On the other side, we have these massive mountains. And you're just kind of blind to them. You don't really notice them. Like the 200 miles of forest all around you, you don't really think about it because that's just life. And when people visit from out of state, it's interesting because sometimes it can completely open your eyes to this world that you've been in, but you didn't even realize how special it was, if that makes sense.
Totally, yeah. I feel like I've felt that so many times when like someone will be out visiting and like a moose will come in our yard, and for me that's just like it's like as common as it is to like see a deer in your yard here. But to see it through someone else's eyes, they're just like, oh my gosh, like it's so big or whatever, and you're just like, oh yeah, that is, isn't it? I sort of forgot this. And yeah, I think it's given me a new appreciation for being down here and telling people about what it was like to grow up there, and sort of slowly realizing that it was really special and really unusual.
Yeah, So I was reading a little bit, like in your About, where you were talking about how you spent a lot of time playing in the woods when you were younger. And it reminded me, So I grew up on what is now like this crazy residential area, but back then it was barely developed at all. And
Yeah.
in the backyard, there was this area that my brother and I called the Pond of the Seashaws. I have
Oh.
literally no idea what the word seashaws even means to this day. But in our head, it was like this, mythical, mystical land that you could run around
Yeah,
with like
yeah,
swamps and everything. And we would get literally lost for hours and hours
yeah.
and hours. And I feel like, that adventurousness and openness like played a part in kind of who I became as a person, even if I didn't really realize it. Do you think that, growing up in that, surrounded by 200 miles of forest, 30 minutes away from anything, do you think your like Alaska roots played a big part in how you see the world as a storyteller?
Yeah, I think I like to do a lot of I feel like I the woods also sort of played a special role for me, and that was like one of the only places I could go to just be totally alone
Mm-hmm.
and just sort of like do whatever I wanted. And I think I feel like looking back on it, it sort of made me want to make more stories about people who are finding spaces like that, or people who like of that nature who like the book. This is getting a little bit into stuff that I haven't talked about other places yet, but the book that I'm writing now is mostly about a couple of kids who are like finding that independence and finding that like adventurousness in a community where that isn't really common. Yeah, and I think that's sort of something that changed me as a person, and that just being able to access that and then having that association with nature, like you go outside and that's where you can be alone and where you can like I don't know, have these adventures. I don't think I didn't realize until I was older that not everybody has that. I think it also plays a part in, I don't know if you've read Chancellor.
I have.
I
Look,
think
right here. Yeah.
I was right there.
Yeah.
I think a lot of the communities that I read about are like very isolated,
Mm-hmm.
but then also have like that sort of like everybody it's like a strong community and everybody's sort of helping each other out. And I feel like I didn't realize until later that that's kind of where I grew up, because like the Citadel is like very isolated and everybody's trying to like figure out how to survive together. And the book I'm writing now, it's the same thing. you know I think everything I write is sort of autobio, um only twisted by fantasy so that I don't have to like put people's names in there or anything like that. It can be sort of disguised. I can talk about like growing up, or I can talk about stuff that happened in my childhood without my name having to be there and all at all, and without having to like answer any questions about it.
Well, I mean, in the community in Chancellor, that's like effectively the last city, right? Like that's what
Yeah.
it is. And it's interesting though, because I think a lot of people who move to Alaska move in pursuit of almost that idea. Like they're trying to escape from something. Like I don't want to get into like sassing my parents, but they were definitely coming to Alaska to get away from something, to find something for themselves that they weren't finding elsewhere. And I think it's
Totally.
interesting because it's like thematically that totally makes sense, but also literally in some ways for Alaska that totally makes sense, because people are trying to find a place that makes sense for them when nothing else
Yeah.
does.
Totally. Yeah. I think that's one of the things that makes it so special, is I think it's sort of, in some ways it's sort of a community of misfits a little bit,
Oh yeah.
in a way that I really enjoy. Like with my parents, they neither of them were born and raised there. They both came from different families and were just traveling around and didn't even mean to settle in Alaska. And then they got there and they're like, this is pretty cool. And then now they're there for 20 years. My mom used to tell me, like, whenever I'd travel somewhere, like when I was talking about like going somewhere for a summer, she'd be like, be careful, because you could plan for 3 months and then next thing you know it's 20 years.
Yeah.
So
I do think it's funny. Like you were talking about, you don't realize how special some of this stuff is. I bet if you talk to other people about growing up in Alaska and wandering around the woods, when you like legitimately like bears and all kinds of wild animals are an option, people would freak out. They're like, how did your parents let you do that? And it's just like, it's just how it is.
yeah.
I don't know anything different.
Yeah. They'd be like, you see a bear, like, I feel like that's another thing, is like I feel like you grow up with people just being like, here's the 3 things you do if a bear shows up, or like if a moose shows up, like,
Yeah,
it's just like normal. Yeah.
totally. So, okay, you're in Fairbanks.
Yeah.
I've never actually been to it, but I know like the comic shop has a shop in Fairbanks. It's a very well liked one.
Mhm.
You grew up in this area that I don't really know as far as the art scene in Fairbanks is concerned. I don't know what that's like, but
Yeah.
what built your early love of comics and art? Like, was there something that was driving you from the beginning, or is it just kind of you picked up a pencil or colored pencils or whatever and just got to it?
Yeah, I feel like I went through a process as I was growing up where it's like everyone's always pressuring you, like, what do you want to do when you grow up? Um, and I feel like I always knew that I wanted to draw. And at a certain point, I figured I wanted to tell stories. And then it took me a little while to figure out how to put the two of those together.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think when I was a kid, we didn't really have graphic novels. That was just about to become a thing. I only had like Calvin and Hobbes and Garfield in the library when I was growing up, and I didn't want to do like short strip comics. I played with that for a little bit, but it's like I wanted to do like big. I basically wanted to write a book but draw it. And I think it wasn't until middle school that I realized graphic novels were a thing. And that's when I just put all my chips in that basket, as it were. I think my earliest exposure to it in the community, because I ended up being able to find a little comics community in Fairbanks, both in the comic shop, and then also just there's only like two cartoonists there, three cartoonists. I feel like in Fairbanks or in Alaska as a whole, there's like Lucas Elliott and like Jamie Smith.
Ted Galusha moved up here. He like
Yeah.
he's in Eagle River, but yeah, it's
You
most
get
people
Ted
leave
Galusha.
Alaska.
Yeah, yeah. And there's Alex Bates too. And I think there's like those are the only people I know about. But it's like we all know each other. We all like kind of like keep in touch because when you have a community that small, I feel like you also like I don't know. It's sort of special in a way because it creates sort of like a um you sort of band together more. You know what each other are doing more. But when I was a kid, Jamie Smith would occasionally teach classes on comics in the community. There was something at like some bookstore. He did a little class, and I remember watching him draw and just being like, "Oh, I want to do that."
Mm-hmm.
And I got a little older, and he ended up helping me out in one way or another. And we did a little mini con at Pioneer Park in Fairbanks. Just little things like that. Like I had help from the very beginning from people who were established and wanted to sort of foster that in the community around me. But I think I didn't really know I wanted to do it until I think I made my first comic in like middle school when I first figured out that's what I wanted to do.
Mm-hmm.
And then from there, I sort of, I'd go to the comic shop like as often as I could, and I would just go to the graphic novel section, and I would just flip through whatever I could get my hands on, just sort of trying to figure out what was out there and sort of taking those first steps in familiarizing myself with the community and with the art form in general. I think I feel like the first like actual graphic novel I read that I can remember reading and being like, oh, this is what I want to do. I think I picked up something from Craig Thompson. There was a graphic novel, I think it was Blankets in a bookstore in Fairbanks, and it was the only graphic novel in the whole store, and it was like $2. They'd marked it down like $2 because no one had bought it. And I bought it, and I remember reading it and just being like, oh, okay, this is what I want to do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's awesome. In a weird way, I feel like you saying Calvin and Hobbes was something you grew up on feels very fitting in like a formative sort of way because obviously it's not the same, but Bill Watterson always had such a unique blend of like nature and wonder worked into his comics that really like fits what you do.
Yeah. I feel like looking back, as a kid I was more obsessed with Garfield than I was with Calvin and Hobbes, but looking back, I'm not proud of that.
No. It also explains why you have so much lasagna in your comics.
Oh God, no. But looking back, I feel like Calvin and Hobbes is the one that actually resonated with me most as a kid, because I think Garfield is entertaining. No shade on Jim Davis, but I feel like Calvin and Hobbes is sort of. I feel like Bill Watterson is kind of like the Mr. Rogers of comics a little bit, and that he knows so much about what it is to be a kid. And he can put that into comics in a way that resonates with kids in a really deep and meaningful way. Like I remember like reading, there was some comic where I think Calvin breaks his dad's binoculars and his dad is like yelling at him. And the punchline of the comic is he like stops his dad from yelling by being like, I already feel terrible about it, so you don't have to yell at me about it anymore. And the dad like stops because he's like, oh man, like what am I doing?
Mm-hmm.
I remember using that on my mom later, like when she was upset at me about something,
Like
because
that
I
line.
related to it. Yeah, I remember relating to it and being like, oh, is this like a thing that I could do? And it sort of, I remember it diffusing the situation. Like, I don't know. I still remember that all these years later, because it felt like, I feel like it's rare that you come across a cartoonist where he can so accurately capture the feelings of real life, and then in such a small space too. I could never do it in such a small space like that, where you just have one strip a week.
I do think I'm not saying that you're Bill Watterson, but I think you're not giving yourself enough credit, because it's funny. I think I was going to bring this up later, but I think one of the things that's really interesting about your work is that every once in a while, like one of your posts on Twitter will like pop up in my feed, like again, and it was like being shared by like NBA bloggers or like baseball writers I follow,
Gosh.
and I'm like, what the hell? This is crazy. And then I look at
I
like
didn't know about that.
and then I look at like the likes and the retweets. I'm like, oh my god. And
Yeah.
it's interesting because a lot of times it's something like I don't know, just like the, you know, just random strips about your feelings during the pandemic, or like your little Prince adaptation you did with of the fox and the prince, and it's just like those little things you do in like, I don't know, 2 to 8 panels or something like that, and it conveys so much that people feel.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's interesting that, you know, I love Chancellor, and I'm really excited for the Joan of Arc book, because actually I think those Who HQ books look really great.
Oh,
But
totally.
but I do think it's interesting, because I do think that you're very strong at short stories, like reading through like your Unversed entry on your site, and then like reading through God, what was the one that you won the award for? Or Death Wish, the one you won the National Gold Medal in Scholastic Art and Writing Awards. Like those are really like powerful pieces that you do in very condensed lengths. And I think it's interesting. I'm not saying that you're wrong about your own work, but it is interesting.
No, that means a lot. Thank you. I think, yeah, I feel like that's something, oddly enough, that I never pictured myself doing. I feel like as a teen, especially, I was very much like, I don't want to do, like everybody that I had who was mentoring me was like, you gotta do short stories to like build up your story muscles, and then you can tackle the like 1,000 page space opera. But I was like, no, I just want to do the space opera right now. I don't want to wait. And I feel like it's something that I sort of fell into more as I got older and I started doing longer work, because there's something so appealing about just being like, oh, okay, I can just sit down and it can be done in an hour, you know, instead of a year and a half. I feel like I've thought about it a lot, because I never really expected those to blow up the way that they did. They were always stuff that were just for me and my own feelings and processing things that were happening in my life. And I feel like I sort of found out through those that that's the stuff that's most powerful for people. Like you have to feel something yourself when you're making something for anyone else to feel something. And I think too, I sort of found out that like, if you boil down a feeling to like its base components, it's like it sort of covers a broad range of experiences. Like I'd make a comic, I make them really vague on purpose, because I don't ever want anyone to like know that I'm calling them out or anything like that if I'm, you know, if something happened in my life. But like I would make a comic about like, you know, something that happened at school that, you know, bummed me out, or that, you know, maybe they didn't bum me out, maybe it felt good, but either way. And then someone would like respond to it or retweet it being like, oh, this feels exactly what it was like when like my dog died or something like that. Like I feel like it's something I want to explore more, how you can make a comic that's sort of vague and almost like poem-like, and have it sort of cross over to all those different experiences. I feel like at some point I want to sit down and try to do something like that, like a collection or something like that of those, just because I feel like those are the moments when I felt like I'm doing something that I should be doing, is when people can see something like that and they relate to it, or it helps them work out something that they're going through in some way. And that's what I feel like what I should be doing should do, you know.
Yeah.
So
Well, I mean, it's kind of like with Bill Watterson. I mean, the thing
yeah.
about his work that I think made it so impactful was
Mhm.
he approached it with like this universal honesty about what being a kid was like.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
it's like no matter whether you were raised in Alaska or New York or Saudi Arabia or wherever, you could be raised in any place, and there was a universality to it. And I think it's interesting. I'm very very known for unnecessary pop culture references, but have you ever seen Inception, the Christopher Nolan movie?
I have not. But I feel like I've had enough cultural
Okay.
exposure to it that I know the basic
Yeah,
gist.
yeah. So one of the ideas that I think is actually really interesting in it is that they're having to go all these levels to like implant an idea in somebody's dreams, and
Mhm.
one of the premises that somebody suggests, Tom Hardy, the genius that he is, he's like we have to boil this idea down to the most basic form of it, because it's not really the idea that they're trying to implant onto the person is complicated, but when you put it down to its most basic version, at that point it's when it can really latch on. And I think
Yeah. Yeah.
it's the same idea. It's like when you're a
Yeah.
storyteller, or if you're trying to dream incept people or whatever, it's like if you want an idea to connect, you have to boil it down to its most pure form, because then it doesn't matter if it's you or if it's somebody else. You yourself you see yourself in that, because it moves over to your own feelings, if that makes sense.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. I feel like every human is we're sort of wired to look at something and relate it back to ourselves and our perspective, you know, because what else do we have to interpret the world through?
Unfortunately, I always connect everything to other movies, which is why I constantly pop culture references here.
Oh, it's all good.
And now, a message from Bad Idea. Bad Idea is over, but there's still advertising, so I don't know what's going on. I guess it's another bad idea from Bad Idea. And now, back to the show. Well, okay, so you made a webcomic called Blue Street between 2012
Yeah.
and 2015. Now,
Yeah.
were you still in Alaska then?
Yes, I was in high school at that point. Um, Basically, after sort of my initial introduction to comics in middle school, I ended up taking a class in Portland. I took a couple classes every time we go out of state because there were like no resources for learning comics really outside of like Jamie Smith and Visual Arts Academy in Fairbanks. So I would go down every time we take a vacation. I would go down and take a week long comics class somewhere, and I did one in Oregon in Portland at OCAC, which is now closed. But it was being taught by Jonathan Hill, and he ended up sort of becoming my mentor um, for like throughout high school and into college. And he was the one that was like, you gotta do short stories to build up your muscles and like, you know, get your storytelling chops down. And I feel like Blue Street was a little bit my way of being like, I can do it. Like, you don't know what you're talking about. I can do a giant space opera. Because it was originally, I never ended up finishing. I got to page 75, and then I was like, all right, I'm going to college soon. I can't keep doing this. But it was originally supposed to be like like hundreds of pages of webcomic, but I didn't like plot out any of the story or anything like that. I was just kind of like, I just want to get in there and do it. But I still don't regret doing it because I feel like I needed to try to figure out what I need to do it the right way.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it was like a weekly webcomic for a couple of years of my life. Tried to be weekly. A lot of time it was like monthly, but you know.
I was going to bet anything that it was actually Steve Lieber that told you that you should do the magnum opus before, because I've had people relay that Steve has told them that before. So maybe it's just like a general, like if you've been working in comics for a while, it's like, don't do your magnum opus to start. But, I do think it's like, maybe it's not the right thing to do if you're trying to like learn how to make a complete comic. But I imagine doing Blue Street, I mean, if you're trying to churn out stuff on the regular and it's all improvisational, I bet you learned so much doing that.
Yeah, I feel like as much as I feel like when I was making it, my goal was to like finish a giant story, but I feel like what I really got out of it was, yeah, seeing what it was like to routinely work on a longer form story and trying to sort of and to be able to feel that grind of like of plotting out a long story and then seeing it come to life one page at a time. I feel like it was really important for me to experience that early in the game. And I think I learned a lot that I wouldn't have learned beforehand. And I feel like when people, occasionally someone will ask me now, like, I've got this giant story I want to draw, but I don't want to wait to draw it. I feel like sometimes I veer towards just being like, just try to draw it and just see what happens. And, if it doesn't go the way you want to, or if you fall off of it, then you'll still have learned something about yourself and about how you work. And, if that urge to draw it is there, I think sometimes the right thing to do is to try, even if you don't finish it,
Yeah, I mean, and there's nothing to say that maybe you start it today. It gives you some like sequential pages. It teaches you some stuff about your work.
Yeah.
You get a different job, and then you come back to it later.
Yeah, or like you start that, and then you get a little bit into it, and you're like, oh, I actually want to draw this story, and then I think it's all about as long as you're still learning, that's all that matters, and there's nothing that'll help you learn better than to just do the thing. So
yeah, and yeah. I think honestly everybody learns differently too. It's like
totally, yeah.
I mean, maybe some people, if they did a short story, they don't learn anything from it because like it's not just how their brain works. Like they need length or something.
Totally. Yeah, totally. I feel like that's something that I feel like I struggled for a long time with making I would try to do short stories and they would just not end. I would just be like a chapter of a longer story I'd want to do. I feel like my particular learning style was I had to do a really long story to know what it was like to actually end a short story weirdly. But yeah, I'm definitely other people. I feel like there are definitely other times when you just have to, resist the temptation too. I think it's a balance. Sometimes you got to get in and draw, and other times you have to resist the temptation and just be like, "Now I'm going to draw a one-page story about, someone seeing a frog that they like or whatever it might be."
Yeah.
Just to figure out how panels work and everything like that too.
This is completely unrelated, but I just want to say that you did a Coco and All Ball drawing a while ago. Not a short story of any capacity. It was just a drawing, but that single drawing wrecked me because I literally just read a lot about Coco and All Ball, and as a cat owner, I was like absolutely devastated by that story.
Yeah, that story. It's one of those things that it just there's something about it that just gets you right in the heartstrings, no matter who you are, especially if you're a cat owner. I feel like I did that because I was talking about there's this one one video of Mr. Rogers meeting Coco, and I didn't actually know about All Ball. I would just like pull up whenever I'm like sad, I'll just pull up that video of Mr. Rogers meeting Coco and just watch it a couple times. And then Steve was actually like, "Oh, Maria, you should draw Coco." And then I actually looked up Coco and All Ball, and I read the story for the first time, and I was like, okay, I gotta draw this now.
Yeah.
There's no way. I have to work through these feelings somehow.
I actually only read about it because I somehow came across a video of Robin Williams meeting Coco.
Yeah.
And Coco apparently was very sad when Robin Williams passed away, and I was just like, this is too much for me. And then I was like, I'm gonna read about All Ball. I'm like, this is definitely too much for me. What am I doing to myself?
You can't handle that. All Ball is just another level of
Yeah. Okay, so I'm gonna yada some of this stuff.
Yeah.
You moved to Portland after high school.
Mm-hmm.
You connected with Helioscope Studios. I do think Helioscope, for listeners that don't know, is a studio based in Portland that has a ton of amazing people in it. Steve Lieber, Jeff Parker, Lucy Bellwood, et cetera, going on into infinity. A lot of other people have been involved over the years. I'm interested in, you went from having this community in Fairbanks that was pretty sparse but connected, to being part of a studio and also being in a city that is like, you can throw a rock and you're gonna hit a comic creator.
Yeah.
How did that help you kind of figure out what you wanted to do in comics? Because that in that studio there's about as much knowledge as a human could ever need about comic books. Yeah,
it was funny. I feel like I definitely moved to Portland seeking that community. I would as a teenager, I would go into the comic shop and I would go back to the author bio of every graphic novel I picked up, and I feel like 4 times out of 5 it would say Portland, Oregon, like based in Portland, Oregon. And so I feel like at that point I was like, well, I'm going to Portland.
Yeah.
And I went to art school for a couple years here, but but it was really just because I wanted to be in Portland. I was like, okay, there's an art school in Portland. I'm gonna go to art school there, and I'm gonna um, I'm gonna find more cartoonists basically.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I think it was, I forget, I must have been a freshman. It was like I didn't even know Helioscope was here. I feel like if I had known about Helioscope, I would have moved down here just because of that.
Right.
Because that's the dream, right? That's exactly what I was looking for, was a big room full of people who are all into the same things I'm into, and you know, who I can sort of, you know, have a community within. And I went to Rose City Comic Con like a month or two after. It was in September, so it must have been like a month after I moved there. And I had copies of Death Wish, and I was, you know, I was that kid passing out copies of their zine to different booths and trying to like start conversations with people. And I think it was sort of overwhelming in a way, because I think in Fairbanks, if you're a cartoonist, that's all someone needs to know about you. They're like, oh, I'm a cartoonist too. And, you know, and there, you know, I would talk to people that were just kind of like, all right, you want to buy something? Which is totally, which totally, you know, makes sense. You're at a con, you're trying to, you know, make sure you can cover your hotel. But I think it was sort of a learning experience for me. And in the midst of all that, in this day of sort of passing out my zine to people and sort of trying to be like, all right, who here, you know, would be interested in, like, you know, who's here basically. I ended up, just out of pure chance, I didn't even know it was Helioscope's table. I gave one of my zines to Natalie Nurgat, who was just like, couldn't have been nicer.
Oh yeah.
Talked to me a bunch about animation, comics, and she actually traded me one of her books for my zine, which just felt like the most validating thing she could have done. Because it's like, here's this, I'm a professional, you know, artist and creator, and she was about to move to Disney at that point. And, you know, basically making this trade of like, oh, these are like, which at least to me felt like these things are equal, you know. Both your zine and my book, that's an equal trade. And she ended up passing that zine on to Steve, and I think it was like a week or two later, he was like, come on down to the studio, and the rest is history. It took me a long time to get comfortable around them, because I am a human that has a healthy dose of social anxiety. But I think it wasn't, I would come in occasionally. It wasn't until I did the internship there a couple years later that I really got used to being around there, because I was just like scared. I was just like, all these people are like professionals. They have graphic novels out. They have like movies made out of their books. But it took me a little bit to like, to totally accept that, like, oh, like I'm like, we're all the same. We're just a bunch of comics nerds, like, you know, and that I deserve to be there, and that I belong there, and that, you know, and in the professional community as a whole too. And yeah, the rest is history. I've been going there ever since, and I don't know what I would do without Helioscope. You know, I feel like it's been such a good place for me. I can just walk into the room. If something weird happens, I'm like, this happened, what do I do? You know, with like publishing, or with like, you know, drawing something, you can leave like your work on the table and people will make notes on it. Yeah, it's just been, I can't even express how valuable it's been to me over the years. I would not be the same creator I am now if it wasn't for them.
That's
So,
awesome. Yeah, I mean,
yeah.
I think it's impossible to avoid like that imposter syndrome, where it's just like,
Yeah,
I mean, you walk into a room and you're just like, that person has definitely met Kate Beckinsale. That person just signed a 3-book deal. Like, what am I going to,
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
like, I just gave them a zine and I'm here. What the hell's going on?
Yeah. Oh, 100%. I feel like I remember the first time I walked into Helioscope, and I went into the back where Colleen Cooper's desk was, and I saw the 2 Eisners that they'd won for Bandette just sitting there. And to me, that was like, that's like the holy grail. Ever since I was a kid, I'm like, that's, you know, that's like winning an Emmy for your comics. And I remember just being like, oh man, I don't belong here. this is I had to wait a few more years. I had to do something. But then I feel like when I really relax is when I realize that everybody has imposter syndrome.
Oh yeah.
Like, it doesn't matter how much you've done. Everybody's kind of like, oh man, I don't know what I'm doing. And I feel like I'm trying to get better at saying that more in public, because I feel like it's very tempting to sort of like, you know, especially when you're like on social media, you have like a a brand, I guess, that you're trying to put out there, and you're trying to like, you know, sell your work. It's hard to be like to get personal like that. But I feel like as a creator, I feel like I might be in the minority on this, but I feel like as a creator, it's important to be honest sometimes and be like, this is really hard, or be like, I feel like this was a whatever, like I feel like I shouldn't be here, or to talk about it honestly in a way that the younger creators can see. Because I feel like when everybody has those feelings, I feel like what what like the best way to get rid of them is just knowing that everybody else feels that way too, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like with anything. It's like I think every industry could stand to normalize feelings of inadequacy
Yeah,
because
yeah,
it's just like it's unhealthy for people to like always try to measure themselves against anybody. It's like whether I work in advertising, it's like if, you know, I'm
yeah,
trying to compare myself to like Wyden and Kennedy in Portland. Like I can't do that because if I did, I'd be like, well, they spend a lot more money than me. Like I can't
yeah, yeah,
I can't
yeah,
do that.
yeah,
But it's like
yeah,
you can not to be schmaltzy, but you can only be the best you can be, and it's a lot
yeah,
healthier for people to. I mean, it's impossible not to compare yourself still, though. But
yeah.
you know what I mean.
You can always find someone who's doing better than you is a thing. I think I feel like I had a little bit of I still do have a little bit of an obsession with Tilly Walden's work, because she's this
Understandably,
person who like she's amazing, first of all, and then second of all, like she's just been making graphic novels. I think she made her first one like in high school,
yeah,
and she's just made like a couple a year for a while there. I remember just being like, oh my god, like what am I, how do I compete with this? I think it's easy to find whoever's doing something better than you, at least from the outside, because you don't know anyone's life beyond what they put on social media and what the work they put out there, that's doing better than you, and just sort of be like, I got to get up to that level. But that's not what it's about, you know. At the end of the day, it's about your own process as a creator and a person, and you improving on what you've done
yeah.
in the past, you know.
So just a couple more things before we get into the Joan of Arc book. I did want to
Yeah.
ask. I mentioned, we've talked a lot about short stories versus like graphic novels, and you do want to do your magnum opuses. That's obviously an appeal. But you've done like short stories, you've done anthologies. I mentioned the one in Unverse, which I thought was a really great story. But I talked to a lot of younger creators who find like anthologies and shorts to be really appealing because they're kind of maybe like lower pressure, smaller stories where you can, especially with anthologies, you can share that experience with friends and peers where you kind of all elevate each other. It's like, instead of having imposter syndrome, it's like you all kind of share in like the whatever hype you bring to it, and then like kind of lifts that up.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't know. I mean, like, while you prefer the longer format, do you feel like those short stories have helped in their own way, even if it's not like a magnum opus in the same way as the Chancellor and the Citadel?
Yeah. I feel like I've definitely um found a lot more value in them as I've gotten older. And I feel like it's the sort of thing where I feel like I realized at some point that they can be just as powerful as a longer story, like, you know, if you do it right. And um I think it's something that I actively pursue a lot more as an adult than I did when I was a teenager. And I think definitely it helped a lot to have that feeling of like togetherness that I've had in anthologies, where we're all sort of, especially when you all have a theme. In the Unverse anthologies, we all had like, we'd all like pick
The
a color
unknown,
palette
right?
together.
Oh,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Because I don't know if you know the history, but those started as my mentor Jonathan Hill's class at PNCA. It started in there as a way of like, he had an advanced graphic novel class, and he was like, let's just make, instead of doing the regular curriculum, let's just make an anthology. Um, and I think it was the most valuable learning experience any of us could have had, because it's like we got to feel what it's like to have everybody, like, you pick a color palette, you pick a theme, you critique your work together. You sort of make this thing together side by side, each drawing your stories at the same stages at the same time. Um, and I feel like it's that sort of thing that you can only really get with short stories too. Sort of the ability to be a part of a larger whole in a group like that.
mm-hmm.
Um, But outside of that, I feel like, I don't know. I feel like I've sort of seen shorter stories have sort of that have that impact that they wouldn't have otherwise on people. That like if you can just like tweet it out to people
Yeah.
and you can read it in like a second and you can like retweet it and then I feel like in some ways it's a more efficient way to get a message out there, get a feeling out there to the world.
I do think it's really interesting. Like, I think Chancellor of the Citadel is a fantastic graphic novel, and not I'm
Yeah.
not just saying that because like the book has like foil on the front of it, which is like always like a huge plus for me. But it is really interesting because it's like with the way that some of those shorts are, or like some of the pieces that you do, like the little riffs that you do, like like the Little Prince scene, or any number of other things that you've done. It's interesting how easy those pieces can get in front of somebody, even more so than a graphic novel, because it's like there's like no barrier to entry. It's a shorter length so they can digest it faster. And I don't know. I mean, it's so fascinating. It's like you're like interested in doing magnum opuses in a time where like a lot of times like people's attention span is much lower. And I don't mean that in a negative way towards you. It's just like it's a
Totally.
fascinating blend.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, totally. I feel like you don't really ever get to choose what your magnum opus is, right? I feel like, you might start something being like, oh, this is like my life's work, but people could decide very easily for you later in the game that like, oh no, this was your best work, or this is the thing that's most meaningful to the public in general.
Right.
And I wouldn't be surprised if for a lot of people that ends up being a shorter story, because it seems like as a society we're moving closer and closer to just like, a shorter media experience.
Mm-hmm.
Which, I don't want to sound like an old person, which I think has its pros and its cons. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see how things evolve and change over time. Even like, I feel like I've thought before, like even just like a paper book is becoming sort of a rarity. It seems like as time goes on. I mean, it's made me wonder like what my career will look like, 10 or 20 years from now, if like the format I'll be working in is the same.
Mm-hmm.
It definitely seems like graphic novels are still, getting more and more popular. There's more and more imprints being, graphic novel imprints being made each year. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what sort of has the most attention at the end of the day.
Yo, everybody. I want to take a quick second to talk about Macroverse. Macroverse is a next-gen mobile comics app, with its tap story format making comics feel totally native on mobile devices, which you can experience over 45 series and 400 episodes, with more launching all the time. It's a perfect time to try it out, too. Many of the most popular titles like Hex 11, Dead Town, Glitch, and more are free for a limited time only, so download the app for iOS or Android and binge away. Oh, and keep an eye out on macroverse.com for some major updates on new creators, new series, and new features that bring real collectability to digital comics in a new way. Massive things are coming. If you love making, reading, and or collecting comics, you won't want to miss what Macroverse is launching this summer. And now, back to the show. It is kind of interesting because it's like you are operating in almost like an inflection point, I think, in the time of comics, where it's like a lot of people are gravitating towards like webtoon and gravitating towards like, I don't know, people are making Instagram comics and then getting book deals on them and stuff like that. And it's interesting. I think that there's so many different ways to make comics today and to release comics and to promote comics that the idea of like, this isn't me slandering anybody at Helioscope or anything like that. But like when Steve was your age, I mean, the landscape of what could be a comic or how a comic could happen was a much more narrow place.
Yeah.
Now it's so broad. Like you could, I mean, like you said, like you could turn the comics that you've put onto social media into a short story, and it could end up being your magnum opus. I'm not saying it will be, but I'm just saying like that's entirely possible.
Yeah, totally. It's a totally different industry than it was back then. I feel like I think about that a lot because I feel like you can almost sort of in Helioscope, you almost sort of feel the tears of people from the different generations who sort of had the bulk of their careers in different places in the comics industry and how it's evolved. Like you have people in there that sort of that worked in like the classic like superhero industry back in the day. And you have people that are just getting into it now who are like primarily doing like, you know, web comics or like Instagram comics.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, it makes me think about, I think about a lot, like how things are going to look in the future. I hope that graphic novels will continue to be a thing. It certainly seems like they will be.
Oh yeah.
But yeah, I think it's made me think more about prioritizing that shorter format, just in terms of like, you know, the primary goal of I feel like most storytellers' careers is to like, you know, find a feeling and or an idea or a moral and to communicate it to people through story. And the most effective way to do that these days might be through, you know, short stories online. I think it's safe to say that is the most effective way to do it these days.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because it's like there's so many different examples. Like, you know, you brought up Tilly Walden. Like
Mm-hmm.
Tilly is somebody who's really kind of touched on all kinds of different things you can do.
Yeah.
Whether, you know, putting stuff up on the web or like getting, you know, book deals where you're publishing things like, I mean, like On a Sunbeam was a web comic to start with. And then like,
Mm-hmm.
you know, I have to look to my left to, where am I at? You know, like Are You Listening? That was a straight graphic novel. Now she's got a book deal with like Skybound with their Comet line to do these like Clementine books, which I'm very excited for. But it's interesting because there are so many different paths even within a single creator's potential options. And
Yeah.
it's interesting because like you brought up with the, you know, older superhero stuff, it's back in the day, it's like, what's your preferred flavor, Marvel or DC?
Yeah.
Go with one of
Yeah.
those. And I bet, I mean, I'm not trying to presume that I know the inner workings of your mind, but I would imagine that that has never entered your mind as something you would want to do.
No, I only really got into comics when I realized I didn't have to do that, you know.
Yeah.
I think I think I think now it's going to be really interesting to see the people who are growing up now who like
Right.
I when I was a kid, I didn't have all those graphic novels. Like I if you at my elementary school library, when I was a kid, it just had Garfield and Calvin and Hobbes, and you go in there now, there's an entire bookshelf that's just graphic novels.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm really excited to see the next generation, all the kids who grow up knowing that that's something that you could do. I don't know. This might be me being, you know, sort of idealist, but I would love for there to be like an explosion of graphic novelists or just comics in general. I feel like my dream is for comics to gain enough traction, not as a genre, but a medium, so that there can be like they don't have to have their own like bookshelf in Barnes and Noble or whatever else bookstore. They can sort of be scattered throughout the store, but we'll see if that happens. I hope it does.
Yeah. I think it's interesting because like the early 2000s, that was like a big spot where creators kind of were fostered, I think, because they were seeing like there was the manga explosion, and then there was also like webcomics were really coming to fore. And now it's like those are on steroids because like manga is even blowing up even more. And then like you have like webtoon and stuff like that. I just can't even imagine what the kids who are growing up, or like the teenagers who are growing up on like Lore Olympus, are going to be doing in like 15 or 20 years if they want to make comics. It's going to be like insane, but we could go on that forever. Let's talk about your Joan of Arc book just a little bit.
Totally.
The title is Who Was the Girl Warrior of France, Joan of Arc. It's from Who HQ via Penguin Random House, and it has you're drawing it, and Sarah Winifred Searle is writing it. It comes out in October. Here's the gist. Well, I mean, the gist is it's a bio of Joan of Arc. I'm interested in, you know, so much of what we've talked about is like you kind of following your feelings and telling the stories that feel right to you. And like, you know, deep down, like a lot of what you do is kind of auto-bio. And this is somebody else's bio. What was the appeal of this project? What made it something you wanted to tackle?
Yeah, it was funny. I feel like when I first got the offer to work on it, I had sort of been trying to turn down longer gigs for a while because I'd been working on pitches and whatnot. But I feel like that came into my inbox, and I was just like, I have to work on this.
Yeah.
I think Joan of Arc is such a story that I feel like part of the reason why it's been it's stayed so relevant throughout the generations is because it's a story that I think so many women and girls can look to. Um, Especially like a story from an era where we had like no rights, or like, you know, we weren't supposed to be like powerful or, you know, or influential or anything like that. Um, and I think it was really amazing to be able to do that research into the actual story. Sarah did so much wonderful research um, about details that I didn't even know about that story. I feel like everyone knows the basic gist of it, but when you really get into it, it's like this really interesting, like you see this vulnerability to this character that you wouldn't necessarily see otherwise, where she's trying to do this thing, she doesn't know she's going to be able to do it, and she's alive during this time where, you know, there's so much war and destruction, and she's, you know, trying to have the courage to do something that'll make a difference, knowing that she might not succeed. Um, and she was like such an outlier. Like even among the people that were her allies, I feel like there are moments when they were like, "Are you sure about that? Like this is kind of, you know." I think it meant a lot to me to be able to illustrate a story where there's this girl that's just like, now I'm gonna do it. I feel good about it, and I'm gonna do it. You know.
Mm-hmm.
I think in a way it was kind of, I think everything sort of turns into a little bit autobio for me, and I think even that it was sort of a way for me to process, to live vicariously through it a little bit, and to process feelings that I have around being a female presenting person myself. And because everybody who grows up like that, every woman and girl has had a moment where they think they can do something, and then someone comes in and says, no, you can't do that.
Yeah.
And to be able to draw a story where it's all about this kid being like, no, I'm going to do it. I think it meant a lot to me to be able to be a part of the next interpretation of that story, you know? And aside from that, I think it was also really fun. I enjoy historical um, writing and drawing a lot more than I thought I would. Because Sarah did a lot of the bulk of the research, but then every once in a while I would have a lot of fun. There'd be like, you know, someone's like, there'd be like a keep or something like that, and it was a lot of fun to like Google images and try to find out like, okay, the wreckage of it looks like this. It's still around. It looks like this. Let's try to like reconstruct where the different
Wow.
doors are and stuff like that. Yeah, it was really fun to work on, and I'm really looking forward to seeing it alongside of all the other wonderful books they're doing at the same time.
I could see why that would have a real connection for you as a storyteller. Like even though it is a bio of somebody else, why that would be autobio, because it's, you know, it's you're seeing yourself in the same actions. I
Yeah.
I do, you know, given that it is a real person,
Mhm.
I don't even know what the right word is for this. Like I don't know if pressure is the right word, but was there like
Mhm.
an importance to you to make sure that you kind of, I don't know, got this right, I guess? Like, you know,
Yeah,
you were saying like with the keep and
totally.
everything, it's like you want to make sure that you know, the doors are right and everything like that. Is that
Mhm.
important?
Totally. I think for like the setting and then also like the character herself, I think um I felt sort of, it's something I haven't really experienced before as a creator, because I feel like as someone who does fantasy, mostly part of the appeal of fantasy is you're like, well, I drew it this way, so it's this way.
Yeah.
I think I know that Sarah thought about this too, where you're sort of trying to get the motivations of the character right. And it's so hard to, because it's like this story's been told so many times over. And I'm sure each generation interprets it a little bit differently. But sort of trying to, I did feel sort of, I felt myself thinking about like, oh, this happened. Like, how did she feel about that? Like, was she like, you know, when she was saying, you know, God is speaking to me and like I'm seeing angels and they're telling me to do these things. I think we need to like, you know, you need to give me your army. Like I found myself wondering like, you know, how sure was she of herself? How much of that was her projecting that to try to, you know, um, to make stuff happen, to do something for the greater good? Or was she just like, you know, totally like, no, I can do this. I'm the best.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Sarah did a really good job of writing her in a way where she has moments where she's like, I'm trying to do this big thing. Am I going to do this? Does anyone believe me? And it makes her feel like a very human and relatable character, which I feel like is like probably closer to what she was actually like in real life.
Oh yeah.
Because I feel like you tell a story like that so many times over, and there's a real temptation to say like, oh no, she knew exactly what she was doing, and like she was, she was resolute, she never doubted anything. But that's like, I think that's sort of the character that we want. But it might not, I feel like that's not, I feel like, that's what we want to see because that's what we want for ourselves. But I feel like so much of the time, anyone who's ever done anything that brave has moments when they're like, this is really scary, yeah, I'm really proud of how it came out, and I'm really glad I could work with the people that I got to work with, and I think it's a really cool interpretation of it, and I'm really proud of how it came out.
Was it, you typically write and draw your own stuff. Was it any different? Did it feel any different working on such a long project with a writer?
Yeah, I've worked on short stories with other people before
Right.
who were writing it. I think it was definitely it's like a 50-page book, so it's a little bit longer than what I've done, but it wasn't like a full like 200-page.
Right.
But it was definitely interesting trying to make sure that I could get everything the writer was envisioning right on the page, especially when it's historical, and you want to make sure that you're not like putting a hat in there that wasn't around until like the 1800s,
Or like
yeah,
a truck in the background, like in Ben-Hur.
Yeah. Starbucks coffee cup, like in Game of Thrones.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, I think in some ways it was really great to have Sarah doing so much of the historical stuff, because she could just send me a thing and be like, okay, these are the dyes that they used in this era, so these are the colors you can use for the clothes. I'd be like, great. And then other times, I as someone who primarily writes my own stuff, I definitely had to adjust and be like, and rein myself in a little bit and be like, okay, I want to do it this way, but I need to make sure that I'm doing it the way that Sarah has laid out the page. Like I get excited sometimes. And I'm like, oh, big splash page. But I'm like sometimes when I'm thumbing it, I'd have to thumb it over again, because I'd be like, okay, this panel is probably supposed to be out this way, But I think that's a normal part of the job when you're sort of having that collaboration between someone who's communicating primarily in words, and you have to interpret that into images. But yeah.
I was going to ask you, I saw you shared a video a little while ago on Twitter of you, I think it was drawing part of your pitch for your next graphic novel, and you were drawing like gigantically. Like it was big.
Yeah.
How do you normally work? Are you like purely traditional?
I'm just traditional. I color everything digitally. I cannot ink and pencil digitally. Maybe someday, if I feel like a lot of that is because I can't have there can't be an undo button. I feel like if there's an undo button, I will just fiddle with it forever.
Yeah.
I need to have that thing where you put a mark on the page and it's there. And then also I feel like I love dry brush so much in my inking that I feel like I can't, it's so hard for me. If maybe someday if they make a digital brush that's good enough, I can transition to digital. But I've just never been able to get that same effect digitally before. I used to draw a lot smaller than I do. I sometimes still do. I had a sort of a phase in my career from like mid high school to when I finished drawing Chancellor, where I would draw tiny little pages with just like microns. Like Chancellor, the originals for Chancellor are like this big, or like what is that, like
4x6?
maybe like, yeah, like 4x6.
That's insane.
Yeah, it helped me draw. I feel like with Chancellor, I was trying to really focus on how fast can I draw this and have it be as high quality as possible. But surprise, surprise, it damaged my wrist quite a bit drawing little tiny micron strokes on a space that small for, a year. And I basically, it started hurting real bad towards the end, and I toughed it out, and then I went to the chiropractor, and he looked at it, and he was like, you need to not do this anymore. And so since then, I feel like I've tried to just draw really big, and I feel like that works better for dry brush anyway. So if I'll probably never do another book in micron again. I'm probably not capable of doing it. So that's sort of my one work in that style, I think, for the duration of my career.
It was a good lesson to learn.
Yeah, early on. I that's another thing where Helioscope I feel like was really good about Steve's very good about, he'll come over to my desk and he'll sort of subtly suggest things sometimes. And I feel like he was very good about being like, you know, he gave me a couple of tips to try to figure out how to draw it, but I feel like he was, when it didn't work out, I feel like he was really good at just, you know, helping me to head it off of the pass and not have a long-term drawing injury to my hand.
Mm-hmm.
I think it helps too, like, you know, being in a community full of people who've gone through similar things like that, who can be like, it may feel like not a big deal, but it will be.
Oh yeah.
You know, if you keep doing it, you know. So you don't have to learn that lesson the hard way.
I thought you were going to say he came over and told you to not slouch.
Oh, he's definitely done that many times. A lot of times he won't usually like, he won't usually announce it to the room, but sometimes we'll be working and he'll tweet like,
"Don't slouch.
Sit up straight."
Yeah, sit up straight. Yeah.
Everybody would be like, "Well, I'll see it," and they'll be like, "Oh, are we sitting up? We're not sitting up straight." No, he's great. He's so good at giving very helpful but gentle feedback.
Mm-hmm.
I still have a little note on my corkboard up here above my desk even now, where one time when I was working on Chancellor, he saw me just drawing like so many bricks, and I went out to get lunch, and he left a little note on my desk that says like, "Why don't you put a panel inlay like over all the bricks so you don't have to keep drawing all those bricks?" And I did it, and it worked great. And I feel like I still keep the note up there to remind me to not, because I used to put way too much detail and stuff.
Yeah.
I have to remind myself that less is more. Majority of the time, less is more.
Yeah, totally. So with Joan, did you letter it? Are you lettering it?
I had to remember for a second. No, I didn't letter it. I just did the inks and the colors, and I think they shipped it off somewhere for lettering. Yeah.
I have a theory about your work. I feel like lettering is disproportionately valuable to your process. Am I wrong in that idea?
I definitely am very hesitant to give it up.
Yeah.
I feel like I really like being able to control exactly what the words look like. I feel like I've been hearing around the studio that there's an ongoing trend that especially the big imprints really want it to be digitally lettered.
Mm-hmm.
And this is my first book, the one that I'm working on the pitch for now, that I'm going to be pitching to the big publishers and whatnot. And I'm really crossing my fingers that I can convince them to let me hand letter it. Because I feel like, I don't know. I feel like where I place it and also what I make the words look like are a big part of how I communicate the feeling of it to the reader. So
yeah, it seems super important to your pacing and your like the emotion of the story and everything you do.
I'm glad that it comes across that way. I'm glad that reads as part of it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, okay. So last question. I mean, we talked about a little bit about the fact that you have a graphic novel pitch, you know, and it looks wonderful. I'm really excited for it. I do actually, a really quick note. I do love, you seem to really love stars and ghosts. And
oh my gosh,
I love that is a continuous theme. I mean, I support that going on in perpetuity. But you know, you've taken on projects. You did your webcomic, you did shorts, you did anthologies, you did Chancellor, you did this Joan book. You're several projects in. Do you feel like you have a better feel for what you want your comics to be going forward? Like, has one flavor kind of stood out to you as a better fit for the way you like to do things? Or do you think you're kind of always going to go the direction depending on opportunity, if that makes sense?
Flavor, like style or like content or all of it?
All of it. Just like the types of comics you want to do, like length, you know, market, ideas, like where you deploy it, et cetera, et cetera. Deploy sounds terrible. You know what I mean? Like graphic novel, webcomic.
Yeah. I think some things have sort of cemented, some things that I've had, some inclinations I've had since high school sort of cemented in places I've gotten older. I've been like, oh, this is definitely what I want to do. I think other things, short stories being one of them, I feel like have sort of changed and evolved as I've gotten older and figured out more about what I want to do. I think, interestingly enough, I feel like I've always envisioned myself making books for an older audience. And I feel like only recently I've sort of challenged that. Because I think it was actually, I watched the Mr. Rogers documentary, and I feel like that was really when it had a turning point where I feel like a lot of what sort of made me turn away from younger stuff was I'm like, oh, I don't want to do like the goofy, like, you know, fart jokes, whatever, you know, goofy kid stuff. But I feel like as I've gotten older, I feel like I've realized more that there's a real need for stuff that isn't that for kids. Because I think like when I was a kid, I feel like I've tried to like sort of look back more at what I enjoyed when I was a kid, and it was never that stuff. It was always like really sincere, you know, serious, oftentimes work that sort of had some sort of emotional connection to. And I feel like with this new pitch, I'm sort of trying my hand at that and sort of trying to make a story aimed at kids that's you know, fun but serious, and sort of, I don't know,
Respects them.
yeah. That was on the tip of my tongue, but I was trying to think of something a little less. I don't want to shade other people's.
No,
You know.
I mean, but you look at like everything that really, really lasts as far as children's entertainment and everything. It's normally like it's funny. It gets labeled as family, quote unquote, and it's because it works for everyone. It's because it respects everyone to understand and appreciate in their own way. Like, you know, Pixar was always like the kind of go-to example that people had. But you look at like Hayao Miyazaki, or you look at anybody, it's like, those stories are timeless because it respects their audience. And I don't think that's shade to anybody. It's just, I think people who are making really goofy stuff with like farting and all that stuff.
Yeah. That definitely has a spot too. That's too. We don't need a story that's just light sometimes.
Yeah, they know what they're doing, but I mean, it's like, I think, you know, it's kind of like what I said, the word flavor. It's like there's different flavors to every type of story. It's just, you know, the one that works for you, and it's one that, you know, respects children and adults to appreciate it in their own way.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. That's definitely been the stuff that's appealed to me more. And I think, I think I want to try my hand at something like that sort of can reach everybody, but that can speak to kids who, you know, maybe need, you know, I think the story I'm working on right now is like the whole thesis of it is like, you know, that point in your life where you realize that that adults around you don't necessarily know everything. And that can be really scary. And I think I wanted to make a book that was just like, it's okay if that happens, and like you're worth listening to, and like, you know, if, you know, kids, there was what I feel like I've been thinking about a lot while I've been making this. There was like when I was in elementary school, I had a counselor at the school that was amazing, and she had a little bumper sticker up on her wall in the classroom that said kids should be heard and listened to and believed. It's like, you know, sort of a counter to the kids should be, you know, seen and not heard. And I feel like that stuck with me all these years later. I still remember it. And I feel like I want to start making stuff that has more of a message like that, you know, might communicate something to a kid or to a young adult that they might not hear in their normal life, that they might need to hear, you know?
Yeah.
If I could capture like 1/16 of that, the way that someone like Hayao Miyazaki does, then I'll be satisfied.
Well, I am looking forward to seeing you try. But Maria, that is all I have for you. Thank you so much for coming on to talk about your comics, Joan of Arc, and everything else. I appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This has been so great. It's so great to talk to someone who is also a part of the Alaska comics universe. I was so excited to do this, and it's so good to have a convo with you about stuff.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Off Panel with cartoonist Maria Frantz. You can find her on Twitter and Instagram, as well as her work in the upcoming Who Was the Girl Warrior of France, Joan of Arc. Love Off Panel, want to support it? Subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts today and give the show a rating or review while you're at it, but 5 stars only. You can also support the show by backing it on Patreon. Find the show at patreon.com/offpanel, and when you back it on there, you get early access to each week's podcast, as well as weekly content and more. Want even more? Subscribe to my subscription comic site Sketched at sketch.com for long-form articles, interviews, and the rest of the site's content, and its members-only forum. You can find Off Panel and Sketched on social media by liking on Facebook at /Sketched. That's SKTCHD. Follow on Twitter and Instagram at @SketchComic, or following me at @SlicedFriedGold. Big thanks to all my existing patrons, including Raj Patel, Jack Mulqueen, Kyle, Carl Kerschel, Robert Masella, Elza Chartier, Luke Nakashoji, Elliot Metz, Dr. Luke, Scott Hazelwood, Scott Buwan, Michael Tund, Canadian by Proxy, Johnny Cannon, Zach Thompson, Bradley Rader, Carl Choi, Megan Marsden, Brandon DePills, Patrick Brower, Declan Shalvey, Dan Garino, Josh Williamson, Adam Freeman, Ben Wild, Brian Klein Q, SB, Antonio Offen, Nick Bennett, Daniel Whitfield, Scotty Young, Susanna Polo, Jeff Weira, Reed Hinkley Barnes, Mario Tiambang, AbductedTheComic.com, Andrew Carita, Matt Mahoney, Charlie Chu, Stephen Hall, Pensacola Pop Comics, Kim Eslin, Felt Myra, Christian Shelton, Kenny Porter, Chris Pacello, Torrin Grunbeck, Buzz Bubbles, Christopher Todd, Transmitter Down, Waltz Comics and Books, Carl Mizell, Danny Ollie, Paul Slates, Akil Wilson, Alex Dimitriopoulos, Terry Dodson, Liana Kingus, Wesley Gift, Sean Kirkham, Alistair Ross, Julio Anta, Brett A. Schmidt, Jason Goodmanson, Paul Ryanwan, Vita Ayala, Tara Ferguson, Dave Slusher, WMQ Comics, Akil Kokachi, Sean Pinello, Ken Heidelman, Philip Seavey, Al Ewing, Ryan Alcock, David Kelly, Rob Wilson IV, Nick Polito, Brendan Fletcher, Jonathan Nilsson, Matthew Groom, Jason Massey, Adam Bogart, Matthew Taylor, Nick Patera, Jacob Sorelli, Ford Gilmore, David Baraldi, Nick Hall, Bjorn Basin, John Hendricks, Steve Anderson, Mian Maxfield, Cliff Chang, Colin McMahon, Chris Palmer, Scott McGovern, Nathan Fairbairn, Kat McKenzie, Adam Highfield, Fiona Staples, Mark Abnett, Mike Murphy, Michael Shirley, Tom Barnett, Jim Demonakos, Norbert, Nick Lowe, James Kaplan, and Mission Comics and Art in San Francisco. You guys are all the best. A quick thanks to Upright T-Rex Music, who wrote and performed Off Panel's theme song just for the show. Check out their music on Spotify because it's completely delightful. Thanks for listening, and tune in next week for another episode.